Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, and welcome to another live edition of the award-winning Everything Compliance. Today, we have the quartet of Karen Moore, Jonathan Marks, Matt Kelly, Karen Woody. We're going to start with you, Ms. Moore. What is on your mind this week?
Well, Tom, I've been looking at some recent updates to the UK Modern Slavery Act that were issued by the government, and more specifically on the reporting requirements that are contained in Section 54. So the Slavery Act is now 10 years old. It's provided a lot of guidance. There hasn't been a lot of enforcement activity, but we have seen larger companies at least making their annual statements, which are required under the Act. Those statements are supposed to annually set out what steps the company has taken within their own organization to combat modern slavery, but also within the supply chain. The statement should be approved by the board. If the company has a website, they should be published with a link on the homepage to the statement, if not the statement itself on the homepage. So pretty high profile, but the practice for a lot of companies, at least in a recent unscientific spot check that I've made, it's a pretty broad statement with not a lot behind it. Now, the exceptions there may be companies that are really subject to modern slavery risk by virtue of their operations. That's like kind of the fast casual clothing industry, agriculture, and the like. But for most companies, the statements seem to be pretty high level. What the guidance has provided is much more detail, suggesting how you might flesh out 6 topics. And those 6 topics, not surprisingly, are things like, how are you assessing risk in your organization? What policies do you have with links to those policies? What issues have you had and how have you dealt with them? How are you training your own people? And how are you training or spreading those requirements in throughout your supply chain? There's a lot more detail on what comprises good practice versus best practice. There's an encouragement for companies that haven't done so in the past to do kind of a level 1 reporting and move itself over to level 2. The updates also include some more general principles, recommending alignment with OECD voluntary guidelines for multinationals on responsible business conduct and due diligence. There's also much stronger messaging on the importance of modern slavery programs within respondent organizations. And that suggests to me maybe we're going to see a little bit more enforcement by the authorities, or at least increased scrutiny. Surely these expanded reporting on company websites and the like is maybe going to attract the interest or the scrutiny of stakeholders. The whole thing, though, is voluntary, right? You have to make a statement, but providing this level of detail is just recommended. It could have been mandated, so maybe a missed opportunity there. We've seen mandated reporting of this kind in similar legislations in Australia. Canada, I think, just updated its own requirements. California even has something in the supply chain regulations. The much vaunted, but now delayed or watered down a little bit, CSDD and CSRD obviously also contain reporting requirements, and the pickup by Germany and France and those in that regard has also been pretty high level. So there are UK companies that may say, well, this is recommended, but they have mandatory reporting anyway in other jurisdictions to which they're subject to. So, it seems like it's something that should be followed one way or the other. Now, mandated or not, there are other laws that UK companies can fall afoul of, even if they don't take on this kind of mandated disclosure requirement. There's the Act itself, for example, but there was a 2019 case for tort liability for human rights violation, a 2024 case, criminal liability for money laundering in a supply chain issue, not a modern slavery one, but an environmental one. But these kind of supply chain failure cases are coming to the fore. And most recently, I was following with interest a case against Dyson, the UK company, where the UK Court of Appeals has said that 24 migrant workers from Nepal and Bangladesh can go ahead suing Dyson in the UK for modern slavery violations on the basis of their wages and living conditions, even though those workers are working for a third-party supplier in Malaysia. And the Court of Appeals reasoning was that the case was most likely going to center around Dyson's own policies for working conditions for its employees and employees in its direct supply chain, and therefore the UK jurisdiction would be appropriate in this case. So will we see more cases here, especially with increased transparency, remains to be seen, but the updates are laudable, if not going quite as far as they needed to go. From my perspective, for compliance officers, this is yet another area where compliance has maybe been touching on these issues, but maybe wants to get more directly involved now. We talked a while back about the McDonald's and Tesco and Marks and Spencer cases in the UK, where inadequate human resources procedures failed to identify modern slavery on a very small scale, but on the territory of the United Kingdom. It's an area where compliance maybe needs to do a lot more checking, both on HR practices, on supply chain, and the like, not just on the due diligence, but the actual substance of what's being done, what procedures are in place. And if we're going to be reporting and being more transparent, then I think, we've got to be ready to address the substance of our program so that there's meat behind the message. So remains to be seen, but a nice step in terms of clarity or suggestions or guidance from the UK government on the Modern Slavery Act on its 10th anniversary.
Matt, do you have a question or comment for Karen?
Probably a little bit of both. I don't know if I'm jumping a bridge too far here, Karen, but as I'm listening to a lot of that, I can't help but think at the operational level for most large companies, this is going to be about gaining visibility into your supply chain. And immediately I think then, well, that's the same as what you're going to have to do for tariff compliance, which for better or worse is probably going to be a big deal in the United States. And, I had a fascinating conversation with a trade lawyer the other day who said in some parallel world, we might have 15 or 20% tariffs on everything, everywhere, forever. Companies could handle that. But what the Trump administration is setting up is it might be 20% here and 88% over there. And of course, in China, it could be a zillion percent, but maybe we'll cut it in 18 months and back and forth. And he said it's going to be a lot of, frankly, supply chain arbitrage, trying to source supplies from different low tariff countries. And a lot of your success there would be an ability to document where your suppliers are getting their stuff from. And it strikes me that how you would do that is going to be very similar to how you would document where your suppliers are getting their labor from or how they are. You're still going to need a lot of the same basic mechanics of it. Or am I misreading it? Because I'm trying to think about how could compliance officers convince senior boards, management, really we need to care about it, or here's how we kill two birds with one stone. I don't know what you think. Am I misreading the situation there or not?
No, not at all, Matt. And I do think that some of this kind of tariff jumping around is going to have a lot of ancillary liability attached to it, frankly, the same way the modern slavery cases also open up other doors outside the act itself. I do feel for companies because right now, not only does your due diligence need to be in place, but the expanding scope makes it extremely complicated. Whether you're investigating a third party across a whole range of issues or whether you're responding as a supplier to a whole range of issues, kind of thousands of questions. How many of those are self-reported? How do you even follow up on the red flags? I mean, it opens up, I think, a real quagmire. But I do think a step in the right direction is the whole know your third party program? I mean, how well do you actually know them? Forget about all the reporting requirements, forget about all the programs and the procedures and everything, but are you visiting their premises? Are you seeing how they're operating? Are you developing a relationship over time rather than jumping from place to place, which I think, Matt, as you point out, the sanctions unpredictability may encourage a lot of pivoting to other source suppliers. So I'm hoping it gets back to that more humanistic responsibility for the business partner to really create a partnership rather than doing this kind of really remote relationship building, so that you have confidence and then it feels like other things will follow. But I did see a disturbing statistic the other day, and I'm probably misstating it, but the average car has something like 2,000 suppliers for the parts for the car. I mean, how can you possibly know as a manufacturer really develop those relationships? So yeah, I agree with you 100% that the tariff issue, the environmental issues, the whole host of kind of ESG issues generally creates a whole host of issues for companies and their third-party relationships, not to mention their own operations.
Mr. Marks, do you have some comments, or you want to go directly into how internal audit helps us in the current tariff imbroglio? You're on mute.
I can't even say imbroglio, right? So I always have to catch myself. But no, Karen, you bring up some really fantastic points. The place where we're at right now, and unless you've been under a rock, I mean, these it's like tariff-driven fragmentation all over the place of our economy, right? But inflationary pressures are also rising, and tariffs are expected to keep prices higher longer, based on what I've read. And under these conditions, enterprise resilience is really being tested. Again, not like it hasn't been tested before. I remember I was reading something that said somebody observed that the global regulatory pressures coupled with these unforeseen disruptive events pose substantial challenges to maintaining business continuity. And it's kind of interesting because for a long time, we talk about the black swan. Now I keep talking about the gray rhinos, which are the things that are predictable, and they're literally going to happen. So this whole concept of velocity, really needs to come into play here with a lot of people's risks. And that's why I go back to, talking about the enterprise risk resilient ecosystem. But business leaders from manufacturers to retailers are already feeling the strain of these tariffs. For example, the sudden U.S. tariff hike prompted companies like, I was reading, Jaguar Land Rover to halt shipments entirely and to reassess their strategies. So I think that's kind of interesting all in itself. And in short, these rising trade barriers, they're not niche legal issues. They're not. They're core strategic risks. And again, I go back to this whole fundamental concept about enterprise risk management, and our companies really paying attention to their supply chain as well as these tariffs. Companies facing delayed shipments, higher input costs, and a need to scramble to get these alternative suppliers. We saw this during COVID. If you looked at people's supply chains, and this is where, for me, really where it kind of bubbled up. When you had a supplier that basically had to shut down and you were looking for an alternate supplier, a lot of people were scrambling and they cut corners and they did a whole bunch of different things and exposed the organization to all these different risks. Well, now it almost seems like it's, we talked about, I can't remember whether it was best or leading practices, but it almost should be a leading practice that if you have a key supplier, like you talked about 2,000 components to an automobile, if you have a supplier, then there should also almost be an alternative, right, supplier to all of this. And I don't think there's anything wrong with having that. I just don't. Some people they call it redundancy and inefficiency. I call it smart business. But getting back to the strategic implications of tariffs, I could say imbroglio, but I can't say strategic implications. They complicate every layer of the supply chain. Import duties drive up costs of raw materials and the like. So leaders themselves should be recognizing at least these impacts. One is obviously supply chain disruption, which I think that's something that we're talking about, right? Two is cost and inflationary pressure. And again, the competitive disadvantages, in some competitors, they can source from tariff exempt regions, right? Or leverage local manufacturing companies facing heavy import taxes, and risk losing market share. In practice, really any firm that can adjust quickly, is going to have an advantage, which I think is great. But with getting to internal controls and internal audit, and tackling these tariff risks, a robust enterprise risk management framework, like I mentioned before, I think is essential. And so if you're assessing your risks these days, obviously, that's something that shouldn't be a set it and forget it exercise. It's something that needs to be looked at all the time. But if you're a COSO bound company, the COSO risk guidance it absolutely emphasizes that ERM must be woven into strategy, not a plan, strategy. People talk about the plans all the time. A plan is not strategy. And so I think, that's one of the key things here. And your risk appetite is something that needs to be looked at too with all these things. But, alongside, these basic internal controls, which have to be tightened, U.S. Customs has adopted the COSO internal model themselves for its compliance audits. So that's kind of interesting if nobody knew that. And the 5 COSO components: control environment, risk assessment, control activities, information communication, and monitoring, are all a useful checklist. And it's something that internal audit should have immediately at their fingertips, right? Not something that they should go, oh, wow, this actually exists. But, from a control environment perspective, obviously, leadership should promulgate a clear policy that trade compliance is a core priority. I think that's tantamount. You should, from a risk assessment perspective, conduct a comprehensive assessment on tariff exposures. Again, an area where internal audit can certainly help. Control activities, implement routine checks around customs filings. For instance, dual reviews and things like that. These are things that are easy for internal audit to do. Clear reporting lines, information and communication. Staff, again, I'm a big red flag fan. Staff should promptly red flag or flag any tariff-related notices that they get. For example, anti-dumping investigations, things like that, trade sanctions. Matt talked about sanctions. Those are all things that I think, where internal audit can really help. And then, continuously audit and test these controls. The monitoring piece to this is something that we've all been talking about for a while now, and it seems to be gaining some more traction, in practice. Everybody talked about continuous audit and continuous monitoring, but nobody really understood it. I think it's really starting to gain some real traction, and it's really starting to glom on. No different than here. So, fraud risks in custom and tariff compliance, common fraud and evasion schemes, the things that I've seen, misclassifications of transshipments, shippers might route goods through a third party or slip them into lower tariff category under the HS codes. I mean, those are things that, for example, the anti-dumping laws that I talked about, or duties, they often declare their products under a different code or trick customs into thinking that an item is not covered by the duty order. So again, these are very specific, but things that a lot of people just don't know. Undervalued declarations, origination and marking and marking schemes. These are some of the schemes that I guess we're seeing in practice. But detecting these schemes can be somewhat difficult if you really don't know what you're doing. So, internal audit, getting back to internal audit again, as Tom asked, what can they do? Targeted audits. This is kind of my list. Include custom entries and trade documents in your audit universe, periodically sample invoices. You got to read the things. And this is not something where, you could pump into a system and it'll spit something out. It has to be done. There's a lot of human in the loop here, right? And compare declared values and quantities with purchase orders. Again, there's some matching that's going on here and receiving reports. Cross-check country of origin claims against supplier certifications. We've seen, again, where they're actually changing out countries of origin in order to kind of avoid some of these things. Data analytics, certainly something that you could certainly use an internal audit can help with. Using software to flag certain anomalies, like if product was coming in from one country, you could check again the origin to see if it actually changed. Much like you would see a change in a vendor master file, same thing type here. And by the way, speaking about vendor master files, that's another thing that internal audit can really help with. That should really be locked down, and there should really be a handle on that. It usually isn't, but again, it's a good thing for internal audit and a real value add that internal audit can provide, certainly to to the organization. The other thing that I think, again, we've talked about this a lot, but hasn't really been implemented, when it comes to these tariffs, is employee training and hotlines. again, I'm a big fan of training on red flags. What are those red flags? Making people aware of what those things are and saying to them, those are the things that really should be elevated and reported up and through the system. And, I think that's really important. And then again, going back to where a lot of risk really reposes, and that's in the third party partners, your customs brokers, your freight forwarders, your overseas suppliers, they all play a crucial role here in all of this. And so performing due diligence on these partners. And again, if you did due diligence on them 5 years ago, time to redo it, because things actually change. That's another thing that we're seeing is a lot of these organizations, not the larger companies, but even the medium-sized companies that have established these protocols for onboarding, a lot of the due diligence that they've done on their partners, it's old. And so again, good opportunity for internal audit to get in there, look at that and kind of help, push the refresh of all that, because you may find things that you don't like. And those compliance practices are really, they're critical in order to try to keep out trouble. So, again, I think the COSO guide reminds us that fraud controls are important, but it does also build, it also helps us build that resiliency through the organization. So getting back to and rounding off this conversation with regards to internal audit, and what they can do, I think you really need to have a different focus today. You need to drill down a little bit more. You need to understand what the game is, and then they could certainly help, work with compliance and work with legal, again, in a harmonized fashion, to make sure that if there are risks, those risks are identified and they're dealt with on a regular, on a timely basis. So those are my comments, Tom.
Matt, question or comment for Jonathan?
Well, one thing that just strikes me is, as usual, I agree with everything that Jonathan's saying about how you do this, but I am just struck that in this tariff world, so much of a successful supply chain now is going to depend on your supplier's ability to generate paperwork. I will show my heart on my sleeve right now. I do not think tariffs are a good idea. Never did, never will. But this is nuts. Your suppliers really are going to be more attractive based on their ability to produce documentation, not low price, not innovation, not versatility, just the ability to generate paperwork for you to process. Think about the diversity of the data formats, the documentation formats. If Commerce Secretary Lutnick happens to be listening right now, a great idea would be to implement some sort of standardized tariff disclosure, kind of like XBRL for SEC filings. I am sure if Secretary Lutnick is listening, he has no idea what we're talking about, but the diversity of this noise and chaff that we're going to get is just mind-boggling. This is going to be a tremendous compliance undertaking, and also, a tremendous waste of everybody's time. But that is for a different day.
Yeah, and I agree with you 1,000%. And anyone who's ever done a third-party review will tell you that getting that documentation and on a timely basis has been literally like wrestling a bear. And not that baby bears are small, but I mean a very large bear. So it's a problem, and it's costly and it's disruptive. And then I often wonder if what we're getting is actually complete and accurate and genuine anyway. Mm-hmm. So it's an interesting thing. But again, my takeaway from all this is, practical action items for internal audit. Tom asked the question. Supply chain review, I think that goes without saying. I think it also dovetails with what Karen talked about as well. Cost pass-through analysis, how that's working. Tariff code verification. These are really easy things to do. The continuous monitoring piece, I think, is something that you really need to talk about. And then reporting upward. Again, if you find something, report it, because again, this is something that could pose a big risk and a big issue, later down the road. So, treat tariffs like a strategic risk, enforce those controls, expand the audit scope, monitor and inform. I mean, these are, again, fundamental things. Collaborate across functions. Like I said, you should be talking with compliance and legal and the operations folks about all this stuff and the people that are buying stuff, within your organization. Identify those fraud schemes. I mentioned a few. There's a ton of them, and then just plan for resilience, because again, at the end of the day, that's what we're really trying to build, is an enterprise risk resilient ecosystem.
Ms. Moore, a question for Mr. Marks?
Yeah, quick question. Just outside of the corporate environment, you mentioned a couple of times things like anti-dumping. Having started my legal career as a clerk at the Court of International Trade, do you think we're going to start seeing more anti-dumping or even countervailing duty cases coming up? I know there's been a lot of kind of noise at the WTO. Is that something on our horizon as well?
Let me do my best Karnak here. I don't. Yeah, probably. But again, you read about this reprioritization of everything. I'm not so sure what deck we're playing with these days. You know what I mean? I think there's a lot of confusion that's been put in the system. If you're an FBI agent, one day you're looking at white collar crime. The next day you're worried about people jumping over fences. So I don't know. Could there be? I think there probably will be. If you look at the order of priority and things that they're going to look at, it might be. I just don't know, but I just don't think that's not a hand that I would want to play. I would want to know what we're dealing with, what deck do we actually have. So, prognosticating or not, and trying to figure out whether this is going to increase or decrease. I don't know. It's the same thing with cyber. Sometimes it goes quiet for a long time, or things go quiet for a long time, and people are like, "Well, that's no longer a risk." Baloney. It's like a couple of weeks ago, I was reading something about class action litigation lawsuits, and the fact that RevRec was jumped by asset valuations and other things. And I'm like, I wrote something on it. I'm like, if you think that you can now ignore revenue recognition as a key risk, you're crazy. And I'll say the same thing here. I mean, as these risks manifest themselves, it's the board's responsibility to really say to themselves, hey, is this something that we really need to take a look at? And the answer to that's probably yes, especially if you have a global supply chain, even a local supply chain. But I wouldn't want to guess on how many things are going to be prosecuted or how many times a regulator is going to be knocking on your door or sending you a letter. I think you need to look at your business holistically, and if that's a risk that you have, it needs to be dealt with accordingly. Period. The end.
Mr. Kelly,
So
we had
passed.
We had a major DOJ speech this week. We had release of 3 significant memorandum from the Department of Justice touching on white collar enforcement and monitorship selection. Here, as we're recording this on Friday, May 16th, what at least are your initial thoughts and reflections?
Well, you could boil it all down to 3 words: less of it. What is the it? Take your poison, man. Any of it. Less white collar enforcement, less monitorships, fewer monitorships, I should say. But that really is the key takeaway here. So what happened, for those who have not yet heard it, is that Matthew Galati, who is the acting head of the criminal division at the Justice Department, who apparently, I'm not clear if he has a formal title or head is now the formal title, but not assistant attorney general, not deputy assistant or acting principal AG or what all the other assorted titles we often see. He's just the acting head, but nonetheless, he's the guy in charge. And he gave a speech at an anti-money laundering conference for hedge funds and investment funds and asset management funds. That also kind of telling, not at a big, corporate corruption enforcement conference where you would typically see the head of the criminal division show up and give a speech. But he gave a speech where he said that they will continue to prosecute corporate crime. However, they are now going to have a, quote, clear path to declination, close quote, that bypasses the criminal resolution process entirely for companies that self-disclose and remediate their misconduct. In many ways, I think that the new policy from Trump 2.0, it follows the same natural path we saw from the Biden administration and Trump 1.0, that if you, company, have an issue and you self-disclose, you fully cooperate, you remediate the underlying problem, the Justice Department will try to be nice to you. And they have progressively become nicer and nicer and nicer. And now to the latest vision of this, where, and Mr. Galati was clear on this, and he emphasized it, that if you meet all 3 of those criteria, you will receive a declination, not just the presumption of a declination. Supposedly, this is to cut the time and cost of resolution talks. I'm not sure I quite grasp the difference here between you will get a declination or you presumptively will get a declination. Um, how are we cutting out the resolution process? Because doesn't the department have to look at the criminal offense that you have and decide that, yes, you're worthy of a declination? But anyways, that's the new idea, is that you will get a declination, not just a presumption of one. Mr. Galati also threw a bone to corporate offenders who are in tricky situations where you do have a misconduct issue. You're not quite sure what to do. That might be something where you have aggravating circumstances, like the involvement of senior executives or particularly egregious and profitable misconduct, or you have a prior bad history there, or maybe the company did self-disclose, but the company did not know that DOJ already knew about the misconduct because of a whistleblower or something like that. Traditionally, that would mean you don't get self-disclosure credit. The Biden administration had been moving to go easier on companies in those tricky situations anyways. The Trump 2.0 administration is now also going to keep cutting a break for people. So if you are in either of those categories, and you listeners who are, you know who you are, if you still self-disclose and do all the other good stuff, you will get at least a non-prosecution agreement, no compliance monitor, and 75% discount off the corporate penalties. They could also still be eligible for that full declination based on, quote, weighing the severity of those aggravating circumstances and the company's cooperation in remediation. So, I don't think anybody would be surprised by this policy shift. There was a lot of talk from Mr. Galati about the importance of self-disclosure. There was a lot of talk about the whistleblower program, which is still alive and kicking. So I expect that will lead also to more use of the False Claims Act. That's something else we're hearing from the Justice Department these days. I think that's going to become the Swiss Army knife that the department will now use to, here's a metaphor, the Swiss Army knife they will hold to the throats of companies. Do what we want, or else we're going to bring a False Claims Act against you, which they're already looking to do that against Harvard University and many other businesses these days that somehow connect to receiving even $1 worth of federal funds, or you are ditching tariffs or whatever. How's the Justice Department going to get you? They're going to get you with False Claims Act. But there's still going to be a lot of encouragement of self-disclosure. There's still going to be a lot of encouraging whistleblowers to come to the department anyways. The good news for compliance officers, allegedly, I think, I'm not sure that this is good news or just not really news. What else was going to happen? But the company will only receive a declination if it meets all three prongs of the corporate enforcement policy that has now been around for nearly a decade. And that was timely self-disclosure, appropriate remediation, and timely and appropriate remediation includes implementing an effective compliance program. So a lot of people are saying this is yet another victory for having a good compliance program, which I love. I want everybody to have an effective program. But in theory, you will not get this declination if you do not have an effective compliance program. And the effective compliance program, one of the Galati memos lists what those criteria are. They line up with the elements of the U.S. sentencing guidelines. They're not news. We all know what an effective compliance program is. Now, that's all nice in theory. Tom, here's where I start to get confused about how this works in practice. If you only get a declination and you skip the resolution process by timely and appropriate remediation, which also includes having an effective compliance program, who's evaluating from the Justice Department that you have the effective compliance program? So that you can avoid the resolution process that Galati just said you get to skip by having a clear path to a declination, and you will get one. But isn't looking at the compliance program part of getting to a resolution? And someone at the Justice Department is going to have to do that. Who will do it? How vigorously are they going to do it? At what point in time are they going to do it? Especially when the department has either laid off a whole bunch of people who normally would do it, or they've been reassigned to go chase down migrants or Harvard University or a whole bunch of other stuff that the Trump administration says now is more important. So I don't really get how this works in practice. Or are they just going to rubber stamp that, yeah, you got an effective compliance program, on you go, case resolved? We have to wait and see. I'll spend one more bit on monitors. They will now really only be used in extremely limited circumstances. Anybody who's been watching the DOJ already knows that, because you've already seen them cancel a bunch of existing monitorships early, against Glencore, against Albemarle, probably a bunch of others who I haven't seen yet. They supposedly have not canceled the monitorship against TD Bank, and they have not yet canceled it, I think, against Binance, although once Trump goes into business with Binance's former CEO, I expect that will probably go away too. But, so we're really going to see monitors in an extremely limited set of circumstances. That said, when they do come up, monitorships will now have a cap on monitor fees. The DOJ will need to approve all the budgets and work plans for the monitors. There are going to be biannual meetings among the department, the monitor, and the offending company to make sure it's working. So even on those very limited circumstances where there will be a monitor, that monitor is going to have an extremely short leash. And it really seems to me like the DOJ is trying to make this so financially unpalatable and such an insufferable exercise. Nobody's going to want to do the monitorships anyways. So, the only other thing I will close with is that for all of Ghilardi's interesting news, he did also have a bit of the histrionics that you see from the DOJ and the Trump administration these days, that, quote, the criminal division has always been a leader in white collar enforcement and the development of corporate enforcement policy. Yeah, sure, except for the part where you've really pretty much said you're going to put anti-corruption enforcement in the deep freeze for the foreseeable future. And now the leaders really are Europe, which is building up its own anti-corruption cross-border task force. They're going to be looking to make an example of some company out there somewhere. And all of this talk, where another pot shot that Ghilardi took was, he said, these efforts have come at too high a cost for businesses and the American enterprise. Even if so, then maybe the Trump administration could have addressed a lot of this in the first administration of the Trump term, and you didn't. Come on, give me a break. That if you want to not push anti-corruption enforcement, you don't have to. The DOJ is going to do what it's going to do. But I think we could all live without the hysterics that what Biden did was bad. What Biden administration and Trump 1.0 and Obama before them did was all a piece of a larger thing. Give me a break when we're now saying that everything that just happened must have been awful, so we're going to run and do the opposite. A lot of times when you try that, you find out that doesn't work out as simply as you think. But that's the news from DOJ.
Professor Woody, you want to start off with questions or comments?
There's a lot of comments and questions, I guess, about this too. I wrote a piece that was published just last year that tracked from the Holder memo up until now, and I should have known that it would be out of date within a month of being published, because we have a whole new thing. Although I am sort of curious what is truly new here, other than they'll scale it back. It feels like they've taken a lot of the gray area and just said, we're not even going to consider that. But I have to imagine there might be some case where, like a new Boeing, and that might be more likely to have a more egregious case now, given how they have signaled that they'll be light touch. But there'll be a moment where even they will say, all right, this is too far. We're going to have an exception to our, supposed just blank check for all these companies. So sort of to your point of like, how does this work in practice? I'll be curious to see how this actually shakes out with this group. I will say, this doesn't change the SEC's maybe take on some of these things. There was a speech this week also by Antonia Apps who said they'd also kind of be a little more light touch, except in the area of fraud, which maybe some anti-corruption things would be fall under some of that space. So I mean, there might be a corollary dialing back from even the other agencies who might have some sort of jurisdictional scope over these things too, but we'll see. I will say that the piece that I wrote that is now just about to come out is called the Swiss Army Knife Statute, but Jonathan Marks would be happy to know it's actually only about the Internal Controls Statute, not yet False Claims Act, but that's this year's project. But no, I am curious about your thoughts on it. What we really will see is if this is a sort of major shift or just an incremental, nod to being nicer to white collar offenders. I don't know.
I mean, it's a good question. And to a certain extent, there's a duality here. Like, are they really going to crack down on a lot of white collar executive misconduct? I mean, I'm hard pressed to see it, considering the executive in charge of their own administration. But on the other hand, if you want to see them implement a compliance monitor, look at what they are proposing for oversight of Columbia University. Look at what they are proposing for remedies at Harvard University, which is going to fight them to probably tooth and nail. But when they're talking about consent decrees or other stuff like that, that's a compliance monitor. That is putting somebody in there to peer over the organization's shoulder and make sure it does the things it says it was going to do. So if you are a large company that is hiring boatloads of illegal immigrants as workers, yeah, you're going to have a really tough time, and they're going to nail you to the wall, and they're going to put some sort of remedy in there, and you can call the guy whatever you want, but there you're going to get a monitor or something like that. Who are we kidding? It's going to depend on, is your misconduct something that really ticks off the president and his minions and henchmen at the Justice Department? If it is, you're going to get nailed, and you're going to get nailed in a big way. If it's something that Trump doesn't really think is wrong, and the more you look at the way he behaves, I don't think he understands that corruption is bad because he's engaged in it, or financial fraud or things like that. He's not going to really care that much about imposing difficult punishments on companies that engage in that. So it's really going to be more like, do you have a big DEI program? They're going to prosecute you for some reason, and they're going to give you a monitor. Are you engaging in rampant bribery overseas? They're going to think that's victimless crime. Who cares? Just tell us you did it, and here's your declination. And that's really what it's going to be, folks. I mean, who are we kidding?
Mr. Marks, questions or comments?
I can't agree more with all the comments, but I guess the one point that I want to make is that, despite the fact that all of these memos and things have come out this past week and prior, it really does shift the burden of responsibility even more inward to these organizations, because, we're not supposed to be relying, if you really look at how that's supposed to work. And Sarbanes kind of taught us this back in 2002 and 2004 when it was enacted and it became in practice, is that you can't really rely on your external auditors, and you can't really rely on the regulatory bodies for picking up on any of this nonsense that's going on in an organization. However, even though it says that, a lot of folks still do that. And so, but now with all of this, again, it kind of shifts the responsibility inward to say to an organization, hey, do we have the mechanisms in place to really pick up on this stuff? Do we have, I just wonder, yes, it's sort of shifting priorities, but maybe it really isn't shifting priorities. Maybe it's really just focusing on things that are, they think that they can absolutely, win. I don't know. I just don't know. I think somebody said it before. We're just going to have to wait and see. But I would not sit back on my heels and say, hey, you know what? No one's going to look at this. No one's going to prosecute this. We'll just keep doing what we're doing. It's kind of like no one's at the toll booth and you just keep riding through and you don't have an easy pass and you're like, oh, they'll never get me. And 5 days later, you get a ticket in the mail because they got your plate. They got your plate number. I think it's kind of the same thing, but I do think that it's going to shift more of a burden inwardly. Our compliance. That's why I think these three hurdles that Matt talked about are going to be, those gates are going to be tougher to get through, because I think they're going to look at those a lot harder these days than they ever have. And they've laid the foundation for that, quite candidly. The evaluation of corporate compliance programs, it wasn't just issued, it was issued and updated, a bunch of different times. And there's been, a lot of talk about certain things related to, the responsibilities of an organization, in some of these cases that have come out, specifically the Caremark cases, and the fact that the board has a duty of oversight. Probably, I kind of, again, I'm not a conspiracy theorist, even though I play one in real life. I thought the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act was a shot across the bow with regards to the internal control piece, and then all of a sudden you get to Fiducia 112 and you get to Sarbanes-Oxley. I think all these things were basically the components of these things have been there for a while. And I think now we just have to kind of look at this bowl of spaghetti and kind of untangle it in a way that makes sense for us as practicing professionals. And quite candidly, if you're a chief compliance officer, I think it's a good opportunity to kind of reset where you are, and kind of figure out where you need to be. Again, a plan is not a strategy. Anyone could put a plan together, but really understanding what the strategy of the organization is and what those risks are and how they link to that strategy, I think is really just critical these days. And that's why I keep talking about these gray rhinos.
All right, Karen Woody, we have had lots of news about the Trump administration and law firms. We've had some law firms respond. We've had some law firms settle. But you wanted to take a look at yet one more fallout from this whole process. What intrigued you and what did you find?
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the congressional investigations, and I mean, in part, what I think they might tip off, which is potential liability for some of these firms. I mean, I'm sure there's 0% there's anyone who's even interested in this podcast who doesn't know what I'm talking about in terms of the law firms that have capitulated to Trump and made a deal with Trump and offered significant sums of money in the form of free services to the administration. And corollarily, if that's a word, there are a handful of law firms that have pushed back and have been successful in their pushback, at least in the courts so far. So given that sort of background, in early April, the House Judiciary Committee, some members of that committee sent letters to Paul Weiss, Skadden, Kirkland, and certain others who had made some of these deals, and just trying to figure out what was going on, some pointed letters. Everyone, I think, after having spoken to some of these people and the staff of these committees are, I would just say, big mad about all this. And so they are trying to figure out how this is, what is going on, and really the extent of what these agreements amount to. There's a second investigation, at least. I think there are more by the House Oversight Committee that just sent letters in the last couple weeks. So we're starting to see real action, granted from the minority in the House, but depending on where things go in the next few years, maybe not the minority in the House, who knows. But the reasons for these investigations, at least according to these letters, are the potential ethical violations, certainly for attorneys, just related to professional responsibility and the rules that are must be followed according to the bar. Also, these issues of coercion by the administration, and that Trump is basically forcing their hand, forcing pro bono legal services in exchange for avoiding some sort of punishment or some sort of executive order that maybe will take away their clearances or whatever, some other sort of punitive measure. And in that inherently is some type of abuse of power. But as I've been sort of thinking through, the scope of this congressional investigations, I was thinking about sort of what liability there might be for these law firms beyond even the reputational, like, loss of talent. There's a number of law school students. I teach in law school. I know that this is a fact of them saying, I won't go to certain firms now because of this. I also was at a conference last week and had someone say that that company uses Perkins Coie, and they had to hire a basically dummy partner from one of the capitulating firms to be the go-between because the administration wouldn't talk to them on some of the matters that Perkins Coie was handling for them. So he was like, I'm kind of fine with even the extra expense because I personally, we believe in this and we really appreciate Perkins Coie, but there's some meetings we just can't even get now. And so I thought that was an interesting thought that, like, this will have fallout for clients and for law firms clients, maybe on both sides. But beyond those sort of, again, reputational risks, I do think there could be actual legal risks maybe to these firms that I kind of wanted to toss out there to this panel of experts to see your thoughts on this. So the first that strikes me is that these firms could potentially have exposure under the UK Bribery Act. They are potentially engaging in some sort of a bribe to for our official, and they often have work in the UK or an office in the UK that could have a jurisdictional hook for some buddy in the UK or any other sort of even potentially OECD signatory state to bring an action against potential bribes. That was one thought I thought of, like, if the US is getting out of the anti-corruption game, we know other countries are stepping up. And this might sort of meet a pretty standard, like, this looks like free services in exchange for, I mean, it's a little tricky in terms of what the contract is and all that, but I think this could look like a straight up bribe that could fall under certain of the elements of these foreign statutes. Also, there could be exposure under the Travel Act, sort of our domestic bribery statute here that prohibits individuals from interstate foreign travel, use of the mails, all those things, if they are engaging in bribery is one of the things. Or, I mean, the Travel Act is broader than just bribery, but bribery certainly falls under that act and has been prosecuted, that they've used the Travel Act to prosecute domestic corruption and bribery schemes. So there's potential exposure in that sense. I mean, I query if I have ever seen a law firm be a defendant of any of these things. I assume not at all. And then lastly, back to our, new Swiss Army statute is, are these government contracts then? Is this agreement and a contract with the government? And if so, is it then subject to the rules and regulations around potential government contracts and maybe exposure to the False Claims Act? It's an interesting thought to noodle. And like I said, I've chatted with some of the people who are trying to think through the exposure beyond, like I say, just reputational, but maybe that this is a straight up giveaway in exchange for something, and that's going to look a lot like a bribery or kickback that could, ironically, get the people who usually are defending those things also in the hot seat. So that was, again, just more of a thought experiment here, and I'd be curious if any of you have thoughts about that, or if this is sort of, again, just a complete spitballing crazy thought. But, one, I thought that was at least interesting fodder.
So, Karen, typically when the bribe payment is directly to a foreign government, that's not jurisdictional under the FCPA. I don't think it's jurisdictional under the Bribery Act. Italy tried to prosecute Eni and Shell for that bribery scheme, and they were not able to successfully convict. And I think it may turn on your contract analysis. Is the contract with the president? Is it with the RNC? Is it with the U.S. government as well?
So if I can jump in, Tom, you kind of picked up on my question here. I mean, to the best of my knowledge, nobody's produced one of these agreements, and it's not entirely clear that there are any. There are tweets that the president says he has reached these deals. I do wonder if he knows what he's talking about. But is it so? Assuming that there is a thing with a signature on it, is it a contract between the administration and the law firms? Or is it a legal settlement between the Justice Department and a firm that had been targeted by the president? And I'll go back to what I just said a moment ago. I don't actually think any of these agreements physically exist. And there isn't anything with Brad Karp, who I think is the lead partner of Paul Weiss. I don't think there's anything with his signature on it, or with any of the other 8 firms that have reached this. So, but if it's a contract, then would other firms have some right to action against the law firms? Like, did they just cut an unfavorable deal, or will they get more preferential treatment from the federal government? And is that some sort of unfair competition thing? I'm kind of wondering, would a state have an ability to challenge this the same way that the AG of California has already said, if you're paying bribes and it's an FCPA violation, it could also be a violation of California's Unfair Competition Act? Couldn't something like this also be a violation of that? Because all these firms have offices in LA and San Francisco. I have no idea. I mean, it's a stupid thing. None of them should agree to it. None of it's going to stand up in court. And I give major shout out to all of the firms that have decided to fight this. But this is just a god awful mess. I'm not sure any of it actually exists.
I also wonder who's going to back an action. I think it's such an interesting thought experiment, but who's going to move it forward as a even proposal? But I think the domestic bribery route is probably more likely, like a Section 201 issue than a FCPA issue.
Yeah, I'm curious if there's a client in the UK that uses particularly one of these firms, and one of these firms has paid the potentially prosecuting body to not. I mean, is this? I'm sort of can a law firm be considered like a third party agent or something that is paying bribes to get you? I know in this case not a contract, but like I'm just curious that there could be some nugget of exposure, maybe but. I take your point. I think you're right about the contract exactly with the government could be interesting. Could be fall outside of the elements of the crime, but there's got to be something there because we all I think are feeling very squeamish about it. But I also agree that I don't know if there's a signed contract. I have to imagine somewhere that someone has, at least even in an email, has some agreement in principle they have reached. But yeah, time will tell. I assume Jamie Raskin and Senator Blumenthal might get to the end of it.
Or like play this out. So the firms have agreed to provide $100 million in pro bono services. So what if they don't do it? What happens? Does Trump sue them for breach of contract? Because that means it's a contract. Or does the Justice Department haul them into court for violating the terms of a settlement? Because that would mean it's a settlement. Like, what happens if they just say no? And I'm not clear that there is any consequence if they just say no. All of this just goes to show what a bizarre legal contraption whatever this is with Donald Trump in his tweets, what that is. But I have no idea what to make of these things.
Isn't the consequence the threat that you get treated like, Perkins Coie or something, like we're going to withdraw all government business and we're going to eliminate your security clearances? I feel like there's that sword hanging over law firms.
Karen, on another note, are there discussions at the law school by students on all of this and whether that might influence their decision to go to a particular law firm?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there's even I don't know if it's out of Stanford. There's someone has a full spreadsheet of where the firms are, which firms have agreed to these deals or not. That it gets circulated even like ahead of the recruiting season that they're so I think it's not off the table for certainly the top students. That it was a talent race among some of these exact same firms, and there certainly are some that distinguish themselves. So, and even among existing attorneys, I'm a now not so proud alumnus of two of the firms that have whatever we call these agreements with the administration, and I know a number of attorneys who have left and partners, up to the top that have said we don't want to be here anymore because of this. So who knows? We'll see.
All right. Well, with that, ladies and gentlemen, we're off to our fan favorites of shout outs and rants. I like that lineup so much. We will stick with the same lineup. Karen Moore, Jonathan Marks, Matt Kelly, Karen Woody, and Tom Fox batting fifth. So with that, Karen Moore, do you have a shout out and or rant for us today?
I do. I have a shout out and something that falls somewhere in between, but following on, Karen's conversation, my first shout out is to my nephew, Max, who is graduating on Sunday from Georgetown Law School and joining not one of those firms up in Boston. So really excited for him. But I'm not even sure where to put this in shout out or rant, but I was so interested and intrigued and annoyed by the abuse of the court system, but also amused by the lawsuit. There's a guy in Georgia. He's a NFL super fan who is suing the NFL on the basis of consumer protection laws, antitrust laws, possibly civil rights laws, but claiming $100 million in emotional distress because of the way the draft prevented Colorado quarterback Shedeur Sanders from being picked in the first round. He's had to deal with this in therapy. Sanders was eventually picked up in the 5th round, but he is suing in district court for emotional distress, illusion on the part of the teams. I don't know kind of what benefit they would have had by pushing him down to the 5th thing. Possible civil rights, because we know that the NFL is rife with racial discrimination issues, which I don't discount. Just question whether they belong here. But in all of the amount of time that courts are spending now dealing with real issues being raised by real people with real concerns, it kind of both upsets me and amuses me that this has received any attention at all in district court in Georgia.
Well, Ms. Moore, you have set a very high bar. Mr. Marks, can you meet her bar?
Yep.
No?
Yeah.
What do you got?
Major League Baseball.
Mm.
You got to be kidding me. People betting on games. I mean, this whole thing about instituting or reinstituting or reactivating, I'm not even going to mention the name, in particular. Granted, great ball player. No question, his on the field skills were unbelievable. But if this is something that we're going to do now, I think it's deplorable. And I think it's cowardly as well. So that's my rant. Major League Baseball.
Mr. Kelly.
I have a rant about one of the latest shenanigans coming out of Washington right now, which is Republicans' surprise announcement that they are going to try to ban states from adopting or enforcing any rules governing artificial intelligence that states might want to impose for 10 years. This is a provision that was snuck into a piece of legislation being reviewed by the House Energy and Commerce Committee earlier this week. It is likely to be included in the final budget bill that Republicans are probably going to support next week. Whether it then becomes final law, if the Senate goes along with that bill, there's a lot of legal hurdles that have to still happen here. But I do think that this ban, this moratorium on state-level AI enforcement, stands a pretty good chance of becoming law. This is a terrible idea. We shouldn't do it. First, there is a certain richness that Republicans are all about states' rights to do what they want when it comes to issues like abortion and reproductive rights or marriage equality or things like that. But as soon as it's AI, no, states' rights are not permissible. And now they want to thwart states from adopting rules that might govern things like use of facial recognition at a widespread scale, autonomous vehicles, using AI in hiring decisions, using AI in criminal sentencing decisions, using AI in all sorts of ways. The proposed legislation would say states can't do any of that unless the AI is subject to generally applicable laws that would be applied to all other technologies or businesses and how businesses use technology. So this poses some really interesting legal questions. Already, state AGs have said they've published legal bulletins that they will enforce consumer protection or state privacy or anti-discrimination laws against businesses. And if you're using AI in those discriminatory ways, they're still going to do it. I think that would still exist. This legislation does offer an exclusion for generally applicable laws. So I don't think the Republicans want to prevent states from enforcing their own consumer protection laws or anti-discrimination. But play this out. So if you have an AI agent, remember just a couple of weeks ago, Jonathan Armstrong was talking about agentic AI. You have an AI agent that I'm the boss and I tell the agent, please book me this really nice Airbnb on the Vineyard. I really want it. Do whatever you have to. And the AI agent then decides to tell the person who's already booked my dream Airbnb, free up that reservation or we're going to kill your family. Like an AI might think that's a good idea. And if it does, does the state have to wait for the AI to do something really bad to then prosecute who? Me, who used the AI assistant? Because I didn't tell it to do that. You're going to prosecute the AI, which is not a person. You're going to prosecute the company that made the AI because the AI didn't really, the company didn't know the AI was going to do that either. All sorts of gray legal areas here. The best way to answer all of that would be to pass a law at the state level saying you can't use AI that way unless you can prove it's not going to do something stupid first. Cut off and prevent the harm rather than wait for the harm and then swoop in with some sort of criminal statute or some consumer protection statute. My point is that we have no idea what the right answer is, but we have 50 different chances to at least experiment with our way forward. And now Republicans want to say, nope, we're not going to do that in the interests of federal law and innovation, which is really just code for saying we're going to wait for Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and Sam Altman at OpenAI to write the laws for us, because that's how it works in Washington. This is just not a good idea. It's anti-democratic. It's stupid. It's not going to do businesses any favors, and it's not good for consumers. We have to nip this thing in the bud, which probably means Republicans aren't going to. That's all.
Karen Woody.
That was a good rant. I have a shout out today that's similar to Karen Moore's, and that is that probably now, as we speak at noon on Friday, the class of 2025 is graduating from W&L Law School, and I'm sad to not be able to make it. So I'm giving a shout out to all of my students and those I didn't get to teach. Just a complete and wholehearted congratulations for getting through this brutal time in life, and I wish them all the best. So that's my shout out to all of those and all the others who are graduating this weekend. Good luck. We need you.
I am going to give a shout out to the Disney series Andor. I think everyone knows of my love of all things Star Wars, so that's probably not surprising. But it's a prequel to a prequel. It's a prequel to the movie Rogue One, which is a prequel to the first Star Wars, which is now monikered Star Wars 4: A New Hope. And it was a great series. Diego Luna was fabulous as the title character, Cassian Andor. And it really showed the cost of what being a rebel is. And I realized that if they all didn't know they were going to die, it was clear they would all die. And in any armed rebellion, you have to make that decision. You're not going to come out of this and be the chairman of a bank or the head of the agricultural department of your government. You're going to die. So I thought long and hard about that, but it's great storytelling. Tony Gilroy did a great job as executive producer and director of a couple of the episodes and wrote many of the episodes. If you love Star Wars, I would urge you to watch it. So ladies and gentlemen, with that great episode, I hope we'll be back after Memorial Day. So I hope everyone has a great Memorial Day.